In this tutorial, we're going to create this Stargate Kawoosh in free 3D program Blender version 3.2. If that's what you're here for, let's crack on. A short while ago, I made a video on my attempts to make a Stargate Kawoosh and eventually settled on this method in Blender. In that video, I said if anybody wants a tutorial, just drop a comment below and I'll get right on it. Somebody did indeed leave a comment, thank you very much. And so this tutorial is dedicated to that person, who on YouTube is _space_. This video is just for you, so I hope you enjoy. So in a new Blender file, delete the poor default cube by matey, and to start with I'm going to press Shift and A to bring up the add menu, and we're going to add a UV sphere mesh. I'm going to zoom in on that a little bit. Now I'd like a bit more geometry detail in this, so I'm going to go to modifiers. So I'm going to go to the modifiers panel and we're going to add a subsurface division. I'm going to leave it on Catmull Clark, whatever the heck that is, and then under viewport levels I'm just going to pop that up a few times, maybe to 4, and under render, and I'm going to apply that subdivision modifier. So that's got rid of the flat faces and we're left with a real nice smooth round sphere. Next we're going to go back to the modifier panel. We're going to add a new modifier, and that is going to be a simple deform. Zoom out a little bit. Under the deform modifier tab, change it to stretch. I'm just going to reorient the view a little bit. Click middle mouse button to rotate around the object, and I'm going to play with the factor slider in the deform modifier panel, and you can see it starts making this kind of shape. We're going to be cutting this in half, so just imagine the right hand side is the Kawoosh shape, the shape we want it to be when it's fully out. So I'm going to go with about there. So next we need to cut this shape in half, and how we're going to do that is we're going to go into edit mode. If you go into edit mode now, which shows us all the different vertices of the mesh, just as a note, you can flick between object and edit mode by pressing tab as well, make it quicker. You can see that all the vertices are still in the shape of the original sphere. So to get the vertices into the actual shape that we want to use, press tab to go back into object mode, select the shape that we've got so far, and then under the deform modifier tab, click this little down arrow here and then click apply. So it's no longer a modifier, we can't control any of the shape anymore. If we go into the edit mode, we see that is the mesh now. That's what we're working with. So to cut this in half, I'm going to change the view to front view. So I'm going to press 1 on my keypad, and you can see up here at the top left it says front orthographic. The orthographic view means there's no perspective. Everything is looking at us head on. If yours doesn't say orthographic, you can switch between perspective and orthographic by pressing 5 on your keypad. Now to delete half of these points, you'd think you can just select half and then press delete. But if you actually rotate around, you can see what we've got selected is only the front half, which is no good. We want to delete that whole left-hand section. So we'll go back to the front on view. If you look at the top right up here, we've got something called toggle X-ray. That makes things on the screen transparent so we can see inside them. You see, you can see through now and you can see everything all the way through on the other side. So now, if we select the left hand side, everything's been selected, you can see. So now when we press delete and then click delete vertices, it's gone, half of it's gone. Pop back to object mode and we're left with this nice kind of teardrop-ish shape that we want to work with for our Kawoosh. Okay, so next I want to animate it coming in and out, and we're going to do that using something called a shrink wrap modifier and then something called shape keys. Dead easy, but very powerful. Shrink wrap basically takes one shape and then wraps it onto another shape and lets you animate between. So in this case, we want to animate this from a kind of flattish plane into the shape it's currently at now. So let's make the shape that it's going to start at. I'm going to Shift A, add mesh, add UV sphere. I'm going to scale that down to just about the size of the thin end of the Kawoosh that we're working with. And just to add some more geometry to that, I'm going to add a modifier, subdivision surface. Probably put this up to 3, then apply. If we just look in edit mode, you can see that's got lots of nice vertices in there now. Back in object mode, I want to flatten this slightly. We're going to position this behind the event horizon. So make it a bit flatter. I'm going to press S for scale and then X to lock it on the X. So we can just squidge it down sideways like that, look. So basically we've made a little kind of Cadbury's chocolate button. I'm going to make sure we've got just the Kawoosh selected. I'm going to go back to the modifiers panel. We're going to add modifier. And this time under the deform column, we're going to go down to shrink wrap. So when you first click on it, nothing happens. But don't worry, we just need to tell it the shape that we want it to morph into, which in this case is the flattened sphere at the end here. So if you go back over to the modifiers panel, under target here, click on the little eyedropper, and then click on the flattened sphere. So all of a sudden our Kawoosh disappears, but what it's actually done is wrapped it around onto the surface there of the flattened sphere. So in order to see this animating, what we need to do is go back over to the shrink wrap, click on the little down arrow here, and then we want to apply as shape key. So not just apply, but apply as shape key. As soon as we do that, you can see your Kawoosh has come back. And now what we've got is down here, under the Object Data Properties panel, it's added some shape keys in for us here, one of which is called shrink wrap. If you click on that, we've got value here we can play with now, and if you start sliding that around, you can see the start of the animation of your Kawoosh. Treat yourself to a little play with that because it's good fun. You can feel free now you've done that to delete the squished sphere, because that will still work without it. Okay, next we're going to make it look a bit more Kawooshy, a bit more watery. So in order to do that, we're going to go back to the modifiers tab, add modifier, and this time we're going to add a displace. So it's made it huge to start with, but don't worry, that doesn't matter. For the displace controls, just click on new. And what that's done is created a texture in the background for us, and a displacement map needs information to say which bits will be knobbly bobbly up and which bits will be knobbly bobbly down. Again, these are very technical terms I'm using here. On the far right hand side, look, we've got a button here that says show texture in texture tab, which you click that, it basically takes us down to the texture tab for the whole item. So by default it's expecting an image or a movie, but that sounds far too complicated for me, so we're just going to click here and we're going to change that to clouds. So as soon as we do that, you can start to see that's a great deformation shape we've got going on here, but obviously it's a bit too much for what we're after. So if you just pop back into the modifiers and then play with the strength slider, something about like that to start with, I reckon. So now back in the shape keys, if you play with it, look at that, it kind of organically bubbles out. That might be a bit too much displacement actually, so let's turn that down a little bit. That's better. You'll notice on the slider here it only goes out as far as the size of the original shape that we made. If you want it to go out further, you can change this range min here. Pop that down to about -1, and then that gives you more room to play with here. So you can get a bigger whoosh. Now there's a couple of things you can play with here to change the shape of the whoosh. There's the strength, as we've just seen, but also back in the texture properties you can change the actual size of the map that it's working with, so you can get slightly bigger or smaller. The smaller you go, the more prickly it gets, and the bigger you go, the more rounded it gets. But what I've decided looks best for me is if you set the size of the displace quite large, so maybe about 0.4 or maybe a bit bigger. That defines your overall shape of the Kawoosh. What I think looks quite good is if we add a second displace onto it. So we'll just call this displace large, the one that we've already got, so we know what we're working with. And then we'll add modifier and we'll add another displace, which makes it go a bit crazy. And we'll call this displace small. We'll click new to add a texture to this one. And we'll click on the little icon that takes us to the texture for it. You can see here it's already started quite large. So I'm just going to turn that down. And we'll go back into the modifiers and turn down the strength of this one. So when you've got modifiers applied, you can click this button here, the little picture of the monitor, and that will show it or hide it in the viewport or when you're rendering. That's what the camera one does. But the little monitor turns that on and off, so we can see what difference the second displace has done. So what's happened here is the first displace has given us the overall shape, and then the second displace has added some detail in and displaced the first shape. So you can see this looks a bit pixely again, so I'm just going to right click on it and do shade smooth. That makes it look a bit more organic. So now we've got two displacement textures on it. If we go back to the shape keys under the object data properties and have another play, that's looking quite good, isn't it? I love how it kind of just bursts out the way the displacement map works. So next we're going to animate the Kawoosh coming in and out, and to do that we're just going to animate the shape keys value over here. So move it all the way up to 1. Again, this is under object data properties and then shape keys, and then make sure you've got shrink wrap clicked. Change the value all the way up to 1 so it's at its starting position. Make sure your starting frame in the animation timeline, which should be at the bottom down here, is at 1. If it's not, you can click on the animation layout up here, which will bring it up, but mine lives in the layout tab as well. So in order to animate something, we just move between one value and another, and we do that using something called keyframes. We're going to specify the start position and the end position. To specify the start position, make sure we're at frame 1 on the timeline, and then value is at 1, so it's at the start position. Make sure the Kawoosh shape is selected, and then to the right of the value slider there's this little dot here, and if you click that, that will create a keyframe down here in the timeline. If we then move the slider to about frame 50, under value, change that to where you want the Kawoosh to be fully out. So I'm going to set that to 0. And again I'm going to press the little dot just to the right, and then that will create another keyframe for us on the timeline specifying the end of where we want it to be. So then if we scrub the timeline, we can see animating the value of the shape keys. So I want it to stay out for just a short while, maybe to about frame 65. So even though the value hasn't changed, we need to click again to set another keyframe. Then I'm going to move it to frame about 115. So we've got 50 that side and then 50 this side. And then I'm going to change the value back to 1 so it's back at its starting position, and click the little dot again to set a keyframe. So now if you set it back to 1, you can press spacebar to play the animation. Whoosh. And back in again. So if that wasn't fast enough for you, what we can do is we can shorten the length between these keyframes. And to do that, you can just draw a box around the keyframes you want to move, and then move them in a little bit, so maybe to 35. And then just grab the end and then move that back to 85. Play that again. Whoosh, stay, and back again. Okay, cool. So we've got the basic animation of the Kawoosh now as well. So you'll see when it's out, we've got these frames here. We've got these 15 frames when it's just static and doing nothing. But obviously, if it was water and if a Stargate was real, we'd like to think that would be kind of rippling and moving around. So in order to do that, we're going to animate the displacement map that's on the Kawoosh. So if we leave the timeline with the Kawoosh sticking out, if we go back to our modifiers, we can see here, look, each displacement modifier has got something called coordinates, which is defaulted to local. What we can actually do, we can map these coordinates to something else to take the movement from it. And the ideal thing for that is adding something called an empty. So if we just go back into the main scene and press Shift and A to the add menu, go down to empty here, look, and one of the things is called plane axes. Click that and it adds this kind of up, down, left, right kind of cross thing in. I'm just going to move it slightly so you can get a better look of it. G, Y to lock it to the Y-axis and slide it this way. So an empty doesn't render as anything. It never shows up in your scene. It's just there to hold data. And what I want you to do next is click on your Kawoosh, go into your displacement map. We'll start with the large one and coordinates change from local to object. So we want it to take its position information from an object, and in this case the object is going to be the empty that we've just added. So click on the eyedropper and then click on the empty. Now if you select the empty and press G to move it around, look at that, the displacement map moves and wiggles with the empty. How cool is that? So what we're going to do is going to animate this empty going from top to bottom, so even when the Kawoosh is stationary, when it's fully out, it's still animated and ripply. So we're going to use the same principle of keyframes to animate this. Because we want the animation of the displacement map to happen all the time, we're going to move back to frame 1. We're going to click on the empty and we're going to hit I on the keyboard, which is the insert keyframe menu. And we're going to click on location. So that's going to be the starting position for our empty. Because we want the ripples to run through the whole of the animation, if you remember, if we click back on here, we can see where we can see our animation points. We've got to keyframe 85. So as long as we animate the movement of this empty past keyframe 85, the ripples will be animating the whole time. So I'm just going to put it arbitrarily at a 100. I'm going to move the empty. I'm going to press G and I'm going to press Z to lock it to the up and down axis, and I'm going to just move it down an amount. It doesn't really matter how much, we can always change it later. I'm going to press I again, insert keyframe, and click on location. So what we can see now is that that's animated between these 2 points. You might be able to see though, if we press play, it starts slow, speeds up, and then slows down again. I want that to be moving at a constant rate. That's automatically done something called easing, and you can see that visually. If you have your mouse in the animation timeline, if you press Ctrl and Tab, it changes to the curve editor. And if we just expand the object transform down here and click on Z location, which is what we animated the empty on, you can see here, look, you can click and move around. We've got going left to right, we've got the time frames, and we've got up and down, we've got from 0 on the x-axis going down to minus 1.32. But if we zoom in a bit further, you can see there's actually a curve to it, so that's where it gets its acceleration and then deceleration from. In order to make that a straight line, click on the first keyframe in the graph editor, right click, go to interpolation mode, and then just change that to linear. You can see that then changes to a perfectly straight line, which means that the speed of the animation of our empty will be constant from frame 1 to frame 100. So Control and Tab again, just to go back to the normal timeline view. So I think that's looking pretty good like that. Just to see what happens, I'm going to also try animating the second displacement map that we put on by changing the coordinates from local again to object and again selecting the empty. So we've got both lots of displacements being animated now. I'm not sure I like that as much. Again, we can turn that back by just saying coordinates to local. I think that's better. I think that looks more organic, like something's moving underneath. So, like me, if you haven't already, now's a good time to save. Okay, now we're going to add some colour to this. Try and get it looking a bit more watery. First off, we need to change it from the default render of Eevee, and I want to use the Cycles engine. And to do that, just go to the Render Properties tab up here, change it from Eevee to Cycles. And then if you've got a separate graphics card, you can change that to GPU. With that selected, I'm just going to go up to Viewport Shading up here, and then that gives us a better representation of how it's going to look when it's rendered out. So if you take a look at that view, and then we just do a render image, you can see it looks pretty much the same. So this is a good view to work in, but it is quite graphics hungry. So if you haven't got a very strong computer, you might have to set it back to one of the other modes and then just switch to that occasionally to see how it's looking. Just so we can see what's going on a bit better, I'm just going to click on the default light that's in the scene. from the list here at the top right. And I'm going to zoom out so I can see it. And I'm just going to move that a little bit. Just to light up a bit better what we're working with. And save. So to apply a material, we're going to go down to the Materials tab here. And you can see by default there's nothing. It's just using a standard white looking material. And we can use that. If you click here on the little drop down arrow, we can choose the default material, and that gives us these settings here. And we can get something that looks quite good just by playing with these, I think. So I'm going to start by changing the base colour. I'm going to choose something a little bit watery, so not a very deep blue. It's kind of a bit more light and turquoisey on the show, but we can always change it after. So I'm going to kind of leave it at a kind of like baby blue for now. But one thing I am going to do is going to go into the shading tab at the top here, because what that does then, let's just reposition the Kawoosh so we can see it here, and go back into shading mode because it's taken us out. Put it back into rendered view. Gives us these nodes down here, look, and these are by default all the same options that we get in the Materials tab, but if we need to, we can start doing something a bit more clever. So let's zoom in on here with the mouse wheel. So the first thing that we're going to change after the colour is the roughness. So I'm going to turn that right down because we want it to be kind of liquid and shiny. Transmission is kind of how much light will go through it. So if you change it all the way to 1, it kind of goes to water look. And if we were to put something behind it, so we just put a quick cube in there, scale it down, move it over here, look, you can see the cube behind it. So if we were to go back to transmission and turn that down, it lets less light through and reflects more off its surface. Right, like quite a high transmission to make it watery. Just going to delete that cube from behind here. Right, I'm going to go back into the layout mode, and then what I'm going to do is we're going to add a spotlight inside. So Shift A, light, spot, and then I'm going to rotate that, so R and then Y. You can hold Control to make it jump, and you can see at the top left, look, rotation, so it's at -90, jumps in 5s. You hold Control and click. You can see immediately, look, that started to give it a bit of detail from the inside. So with your spotlight selected, start cranking the power up and see what happens. So I'm going to try something like 200. So then if we animate that, it's giving it some depth, look. Right, I'm also going to add a couple of area lights. We're going to put one above and one below. So Shift A, add light area. I'm going to press G to move this and Z to move it up. Click to accept, and I'm going to press G again and then X to move it along this way so it's above. You can see, look, that's starting to give some more depth to it. I'm going to click the area light and I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate it. And once you've done that, it's attached to the mouse. So I'm going to press Z to lock it to the Z axis, and I'm going to move it down under here, underneath. And I'm going to press R for rotate, and then X to stick it to one particular axis, hold Control and then rotate it 180. So you can play with the strength of these lights, so you can turn them up. You can make the whole light bigger. Pressing S to scale it. And there you go, look, we're getting something more closely resembling a Kawoosh. So just for the sake of completeness, I'm going to import the Stargate model that I found online, and I'll put a link to where you can download it to if you want in the description below. So file, import, I think it was a GLB file. There we go, Stargate GLB, import. So that's a bit big, so I'm just going to scale it down by pressing S and bringing it down to about here. Next thing to make is the event horizon. That's super easy. For now, I'm just going to click on the Kawoosh and I'm going to hide it over here. You'll notice it's still called Sphere. I've been quite lazy. I've not named anything in here, but there's only a few items, so we're not going to get lost. So to make the event horizon, I'm going to add a plane to the scene. So Shift A, add mesh plane. I'm going to rotate that. So R and then Y to lock it to the plane. I'm going to hold Control and just rotate it 90 degrees. Just as a side note, if we undo that, if you press R for rotate and then Y to lock it to that plane, you can just type in 90, press enter, and it does it, so you don't have to bother moving the mouse around. I'm going to scale this plane so it's roughly the same size. We only want the internal diameter of the gate, and then I'm just going to press tab to go into edit mode. I'm going to right click and subdivide a few times just to give this quite a bit of geometry to work with. So we just need to cut out the bits that we don't need, and the easiest way to do that, change your selection mode from select box by clicking and holding to select circle. You see the circle here, and then change the radius, whack it right up till it's about the same size as your Stargate. Then you just click, and then that's selected the vertices that we want to keep. So we need to invert that selection, so just go to select, invert, or you can press Ctrl I, and then just tap delete, and then select vertices. So we're just left with the plain circle cut out in the middle. Let's go back into object mode. I'm just going to change the shading mode back to rendered so we can see more of what's going on. I'm going to change the material first into the same material that we're using for the Kawoosh. You can see it's added the materials here that came with the Stargate. We're just going to use the one called material because I didn't rename that either. So now we've applied the water material to the event horizon. You might be wondering, what are these strange shapes in here? Well, they are actually our area lights being reflected. Because the material has got a roughness of 0, it's basically behaving like a mirror. And the lights are being reflected. Even though we can't see them directly, we can see them in the reflections. So if we just briefly turn our Kawoosh back on, the white that we can see here, that's not actually light that's falling onto the Kawoosh, that's a reflection of the area light, the same as it is in there. Now obviously we don't want this, so we can turn off the reflections caused by lights that shouldn't really be there. So to do this, just click on each light individually and then go into the object properties. Scroll down, go to the visibility tab, and here we've got ray visibility, and the one we want to turn off is glossy. You can see, look, as soon as we tick that, the reflection of the light disappears. But if we turn the light on and off, it's still casting the light from the light, just not its reflection. So we'll do that for the same area light up here. Ray visibility, glossy, off. So back to the event horizon, we'll hide our Kawoosh again. Okay, so now we've got rid of those reflections, what I want to do is add some ripples to the event horizon. And we do that in exactly the same way as we did to the Kawoosh. We're going to apply a displacement modifier to it. So, modifier properties, add modifier, displace. Again, it's popped out weird to start with, but if we click on new and then go into the show texture in texture tab, change it from image or movie to clouds. There we go, start of the ripples. We go back into the modifier and we just turn the strength down until we're happy with it. It's going to move it backwards a little bit so it sits inside the Stargate better. I also want these ripples to be animated. Now we could just apply the displacement coordinates to that empty again, but it's moving downwards. So what you'll notice We'll just change to a different shading mode so you can see is the ripples are going down. We don't want that, so what I'm going to do quickly is just add another empty plane axes. I'm going to go back to frame 1. I'm going to set that as the starting position, and instead of going up and down I'm going to move this backwards and forwards. So frame 100, I want to move this empty on the X axis. We're going to pop it out to about here. We're going to set another keyframe by pressing I, location. We've got that animating. We're going to go back to our event horizon. We're going to change the coordinates to be driven by this new empty. So then if we animate that, it's not moving up and down anymore, but backwards and forwards. You see it's still got that easing on, so we just want to change that again. So let's click on the empty. Instead of going into the graph editor, we can just right click on the keyframe, go to interpolation mode and linear, and then we've got exactly what we want. Just going to have a quick tidy up, so just going to rename some stuff. We're going to call it empty event horizon driver. We're going to call that other empty Kawoosh driver. So if we turn our Kawoosh back on, we can see that its starting position is a bit proud. It's forward of the event horizon. So just going to select it, just going to move it back a little bit to behind there. I'm going to turn the X-ray feature off at the top. I'm going to change it back to shading view. So now we've got the Kawoosh coming out of the event horizon. I'm going to change the shading view again just so it's easier to see. Whoosh. There you have a Kawooshing Stargate. So just a few more things to tidy up, still in Blender. I'm going to put another light in. We're going to have another spotlight. Tell you what, I'm going to take the one we've got here that we already played with, and I'm going to Shift D to duplicate that. I'm going to press X to bring it out a little bit. I'm going to press R, I'm going to press Y to lock it, and then I'm going to rotate it 180 so it's pointing right back at the event horizon. I'm going to up the power. Let's try 500 maybe. And actually, I'm probably just going to try bringing the angle in a little bit, so we've got more shine in the middle. Okay, let's pop the Kawoosh back on. I think I want a few more highlights, so I'm going to duplicate that spotlight as well. Hide the Kawoosh. Duplicate that. X, move it back here. Then it'll be shining on the front of our Kawoosh as well. So you can see at the moment that this Kawoosh is actually casting a shadow from the spotlight that we're shining onto it. You can see it down here, look. So if we don't want this to cast a shadow, all we have to do is go into the object properties, back into the ray visibility and untick shadow. So as something that's supposedly giving off light, it shouldn't really be casting shadows. I want to up the displacement map on my event horizon a bit. It doesn't look knobbly enough to me. So I'm just going to switch back to the material. So I'm just going to switch back to the solid display view so we can get a better idea of how the ripples look. So they look too big at the moment. Now I've turned them up, so turn them down a little bit more. To make the Stargate look bigger, I'm going to make the ripples denser. So to do that, I'm going to edit the texture again, the clouds texture. So modifier, displace, this icon over here on the right. And I'm going to turn the size down. And that will give us more ripples. RPI, more RPI, ripples per inch. So now I've done that, we can see that the displacement map's still a bit too strong. So back into here, strength down again. A bit more than 0 is probably good. Let's try 0.05. That looks better. Now we're in the solid view again. I can see that the Kawoosh is sticking out before and after look. So I'm just going to move that back a little bit further. There we go, you can't see it until you're meant to be able to now. Let's render this out and see how it's looking. So with the mouse in the main layout screen, I'm going to hit 0 on my keypad. And that will take us to the camera view. So there's a default camera put in the scene. You can see it there, look. So 0 goes into that camera. If you come over here on the right, there's a tiny little arrow. If you click on that, you get this menu up here. If you select your camera and then go to view, one of the tick boxes is camera to view. If you tick that, when you now move the scene using your mouse, we're actually moving the camera. So we can zoom in, we can hold left shift and middle mouse button to move, and then just middle mouse button to rotate. So we can position it nicely into the middle of our screen. Now to render an animation, probably teaching Granny to suck eggs here, but we'll just go over it in case anybody doesn't know. We come over to the render properties. We've got samples here, look. Samples are kind of the number of calculations it does when it's rendering out. The higher the number, the more it bounces light around and the better your render looks, the less grainy it looks. So if we hit render image, we can see, look, up here, sample, it defaults to 4096, and even with my good graphics card, it's taking this long to do one single frame. But for just purposes of seeing how the animation looks, we'll close that down. I'm going to change max samples under the render tab. I'm just going to change that to 100 for now, so not very many at all. So if now we click render image, it only takes 4 seconds to do one frame. What I'm also going to do is go into the output properties, and you can see by default it's set to HD resolution, so 1920 by 1080. I'm going to use this percentage here to just scroll this right down to something like 20%. Then if we do a render, we can see it's tiny, but it renders in less than a second. So this is perfect just for a preview to see what the animation looks like. Now before we render out this animation, we need to set this start and end time on the timeline. And you can do that up here, look. Start 1, end by default is 250, but we know that all the action's over by frame 80. So I'm going to set the end to 80, and that trims down our timeline, look. You can middle click to move the timeline, and you can use the mouse scroll wheel to zoom in and out of the timeline. So render animation, and we'll let that cook for a while. So we've got 80 frames to do. That's just ploughing through that, look. Okay, so we close this window, go back to render, and then view animation. Okay, so that's not terrible. There's a few things we could play around with, like the speed it comes out, the size that it comes out with. I'd probably stretch that out a little bit so it shoots out a bit further. We can actually do that in the shape keys very easily. Let's just do that quickly. So click on the Kawoosh. We've got our keyframes here. And if you remember, we'll go back into the object data properties. We animated it, the value of the shape keys from 1 to 0, but because we changed this range min earlier, we can actually make it bigger if we want and go further than 0. So we could have it coming all the way out here. When you've made a change, it's important you need to click this dot twice. So one to turn off the keyframe, and again to record the new value. To have it stay that far out as well, because it's going to animate back down to 0 again like we had on this keyframe. Take the keyframe off. So we've changed that to minus 0.381. So we want to change that to the same, minus 0.381. And then create a new keyframe. Whoosh, out, in, job done. I think the Kawoosh needs to come out with a bit more force, so I'm going to alter the keyframes just to make it come out and go in a bit quicker. To do that, we just go back down to the timeline, select all keyframes but the one at the start, and we just bring them forward, and then select the last ones, bring those forward too. Gives it more of an explosive look then. So that's the basics of having your own Stargate Kawoosh. One thing I will say is if you follow this tutorial again from the beginning, doing exactly what you've done now, it will look different. Mainly because the way that the displacement map gets generated. The clouds are never quite the same. I never quite use the same values if I'm just sliding it by hand. I'm just going to do a few tweaks, see if we can make this look a bit better. I'm going to start by turning off the default light. Give a bit more depth to the Stargate itself. Since I made the Stargate come out a bit further, I realised that I need to move the spotlight backwards a bit that's shining on the front of it. So we'll just select that, then press G and X and just move it further forward of the fully extended Kawoosh. If you want to have a look from a different angle, don't forget to untether your camera by unclicking the camera to view button. I'm going to turn up the intensity of this light, see what happens, maybe to about 2000. Maybe just move it a little bit further. Turn that down a little bit more, that was too bright. One thing I am going to try, if you know the angle that you're going to be seeing the Stargate from, we can shine lights through it. It doesn't have to be symmetrically placed. So I'm going to grab our original spotlight and I'm going to duplicate that with Shift D. I'm going to press Y to lock it to sideways movement. Just put it over here. Then I'm going to rotate it into the Stargate. Go back to our camera by pressing 0. I'm going to move that light around until it gives us some nice lighting from inside. Maybe move the camera a little bit to the front. Just give it a few highlights on the inside. I'm going to see what happens if we turn up the intensity of our area lights as well. Going to go crazy. Try 1000. Nope, too much. 500? 200. You can always turn the lights on and off to see what difference they're making. You know what? I think it might look better without that light on actually. So I don't think that looks too bad. Just going to try putting some emission into the material. So if you Shift A and then search BSDF, principled BSDF, so another standard colour, into the volume, and then changing the emission to white, then turning down the emission strength. Maybe try changing the emission colour to another blue. That looks quite nice. One thing that I did notice on the render was it looks like the ripples are going a bit too fast on the event horizon. To change the speed of the ripples of the event horizon, all we need to do is change the speed at which this empty is moving. The easiest way to do that is to click on the empty and see its keyframes. So we've got the start position to the end position. If you just use your mouse wheel to scroll out on the timeline, click anywhere to deselect the keyframes, and then just select the keyframes at the end. And then if you were to move them from 100 to 200, that means it takes the empty twice as long to move the same distance, which means we've halved the speed of the ripples of the event horizon. Still not quite happy with them, to be honest. I think they're still a little bit too bumpy. Let's go back to the displace modifier, and then I'm going to click on the icon on the right to take us back to the texture editor. Maybe just change the depth slightly. That's better, they're slightly smoother now. One final thing that I wanted to show you. So you can carry on tweaking the look of your Stargate by just playing around with the strength of the displacement. You can make it more lumpy. You can play with the size of the displacement map to make it smoother or different shape. It's basically just a black and white interference pattern, and where it's white it's higher, the bumps are higher, and where it's black the bumps are lower. I should have explained that before, sorry. There's different types of noise that you can generate, and that will affect how your Kawoosh looks. So by default it's set to Blender Original and Soft. If we were to change that to Hard, you see how the pattern changes, and that gives you a completely different look. And then as well as that, noise basis, there's all these different ones you can try. So you can try Perlin, and that just changes the pattern, the underlying pattern of the height map. So it's just a case of going through and seeing which one you like the look of the best. That one actually looks really good. I've not tried that one before, but I think that makes it look a lot more bubbly. Look at that. Oh, I think we've just hit upon something here. So we've gone. That was the original. And then Voronoi Crackle. Oh yes, I do like that. One final thing I've decided to do is lose the bit where it stays out. Having watched the render back, it looks kind of, it goes out and then it like stops and hits a brick wall before it goes back in. So what I'm going to do is just delete one of these lots of middle keyframes. I'm going to move that into the middle, maybe take a little bit longer to come out and a little bit longer to go back in. I think that looks a bit closer to the original. Right, I'm going to render that out and see how that looks. So if you've stuck to the end and you've followed this tutorial, I'd absolutely love to see what you've come up with. There's no better feeling for me than knowing that you've helped somebody, even in some small way. If you've got any ideas on how to improve it, or if you've changed some settings and yours looks a million times better than this, please don't be shy, leave a comment. Let me know how it went. I won't be making many more videos like this because I don't fancy getting into being a tutorial channel, but I am going to be making some awesome videos. So I'd love it if you subscribed and stuck around to see what I come up with. Thanks _space_hyphen for requesting this tutorial. I hope it was what you were after. Catch you all soon. Bye.